Nancy, as many of you know, has we're here obviously to celebrate Hemingway's passions, but this is not her first book about Hemingway. Before that, she wrote Influencing Hemingway. My most favorite detail about Nancy is that her love for Hemingway and the beginning of her research on Hemingway was from being a high school teacher here in Oak Park, an English teacher at Oak Park River Forest High School, which is where I went to high school. And back then, we took turns a week at a time. We got to take English in the room that Hemingway had taken English in. We were challenged to write in the style of Hemingway. Times have changed a bit. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. But I wanted to start by you've written a book before about Hemingway. Plenty of people have written books about Hemingway, and here's a new one. And I thoroughly enjoyed it and did find it to be a really fresh take. And I'm very curious to know what sparked this whole new angle into Hemingway for you.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. Friends, family, sailing friends, children, relatives. And here we are, and welcome to Ernest's house. And it's so exciting. I think this is the place where he was born. Upstairs, 1899, July 21st. And he lived here until he was 6 years old, and it was his maternal grandmother's and grandfather's home. When his mother received her inheritance, she built a new house a few blocks north, and Ernest and the family moved there. He was the second of 6 children. He went to public school just around the corner, Oliver Wendell Holmes School, and he went to Oak Park River Forest High School, as Kate mentioned. I need to clarify, I was not his teacher. So I love teaching Hemingway, and one of my students said to me, "Mrs. Sindelar, were you his teacher?" And the class went, no. But just going back a little bit about what went on in this house is his parents were very, very strict. And his father was a doctor, a medical doctor, chief of obstetrics at Oak Park High School. And his mother, or at Oak Park Hospital, and his mother was very much interested in the arts, and she developed a family orchestra in this room. She played the piano over there. Ernest had to play the cello. The father played the cornet. And I mean, he had this amazing childhood here because he was able to go to good schools in this area. The family would take the train downtown and go to the symphony and go to the Art Institute. And, it all kind of came together later on in his life. The other thing is that Ernest kind of has this reputation of being a womanizer and drinking and carrying on and doing a lot of wild stuff. But the family was very strict. Many of his relatives were educated at Wheaton College, which was a very conservative Protestant school. It's still there. And so the father and mother, particularly the father in this house, no drinking, no smoking, no dancing, no card playing. That was the way he was brought up. And he had a very religious education. The kids all went to Sunday school at the church on Lake Street, the Congregational Church. And if you go through Ernest's writings, you can see the influence of religion. Just for example, the title "Sun Also Rises" comes from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And if you read Old Man in the Sea, you see that the old man, there's a lot of Christ symbolism in there. And so this religion was very important in Ernest's life, and it all started here. So even though it's sort of crowded, I think it's exciting to be in his house, because if you read the book, you'll see that he went on from here. And he started out in this Victorian atmosphere here in Oak Park, but he really became a citizen of the world, and moved on to Italy, France, Cuba, He's buried in Idaho near the Sun Valley Ski Resort. But he had an amazing life. So, getting back to Kate's question.
So speaking of traveling, I believe you've presented a bunch on Hemingway, and some of which was on a cruise ship, and I think that's where you said the idea for this book came to you, right?
Well, yes. One of the things that has happened after writing the first book, I had the opportunity to give a lot of lectures, and people were interested in Hemingway's women. And they sort of thought that he was a womanizer. But if you read the book, you'll see that the women went after him. And if you look at the cover, particularly of Influencing Hemingway, the first book, he's very handsome when he's young, and he's a storyteller, and he exudes this masculinity because he's hunting, he's fishing, he's doing all this stuff, and women are attracted to him. So first there's Hadley Richardson, his first wife, who is portrayed frequently as being very shy and insecure, but I found her letters. And they're in the book. And she writes to him, she's living in St. Louis, and she's like, I can't wait to see you again. And then, they're thinking about getting married, and she goes, I want to put your head against my breasts and just hold you. Now, poor Hadley never thought these letters were going to be published. But they are in that book. So, Hadley and others.
So what did this new angle help you to see about Hemingway's works and Hemingway the man that your previous research didn't quite illuminate?
Well, what I found out a lot is how closely his personal life is related to his literature. I think we all knew that, sure, he went off to World War I and he wrote Farewell to Arms. Sure, he loved the bullfights in Spain, and he wrote The Sun Also Rises. But what I found out is how dangerous it was to be his friend, because you'd show up in a book. And not always in a positive way. So, a good example, I don't want to give away the book, because I want you all to buy a copy. But Agnes von Kurowski was the nurse that he fell in love with in Italy. So he leaves this house. He doesn't go to college. He goes to St. Louis, Kansas City. He works for the Kansas City Star for a while, and then he is recruited to be an ambulance driver in Italy by the American Red Cross. He's injured, he's in the hospital, and he falls in love with this nurse. Now he's 19 years old. This is his first love. And she kind of leads him on. When you read the book, you'll see that, she's thinking he's pretty cute.
And how old is she?
She's 7 years older than he is. And he thinks that when he gets back to Oak Park, they're going to get married. Well, no. She eventually writes a Dear John letter, and they don't get married. But he takes this relationship and he turns it into a farewell to arms. Now, Agnes spends the rest of her life never saying anything until the very end of her life that she knew Ernest Hemingway. But she recognizes this character in A Farewell to Arms by the name of Catherine Barclay. Never has an author, I could say a man, but maybe I wouldn't say it, just say an author, been so obvious about his desires about a particular woman, because in A Farewell to Arms, he and this nurse have this affair. I mean, not only does he love her, but she loves him. They are in bed in the hospital. She becomes pregnant. They run off to Switzerland together. And so he is fulfilling all of his wishes about Agnes von Kurowski in this book. Now, it took 2 marriages in 10 years, but he takes that whole relationship and he puts it in a book. And there are a number of examples in my book where I'm showing you how he takes a personal experience and turns it into a character, not always in a positive way. So it was really sort of fun to research that, because I knew his literature pretty well. And then when I started reading about these women, I thought, oh my goodness, I know where this came from. And so it was sort of fun.
So you could see how his real life was showing up in his fiction.
Very much.
What did this project illuminate about him as a person that you might not have seen before?
Well, I kind of knew it, but it really was obvious. He keeps moving on to new places. And, one thing that I should dispel is that I never, with all the reading and research I've done, I've never read that he said Oak Park was the place of wide lawns and narrow minds. Yeah, right. I mean, and people frequently think he said that. I don't think he did. But he does have this quest of moving on. So it wasn't like he didn't like Oak Park, but he leaves here, he goes to Italy, he comes back, he eventually goes to Paris, then he goes to Key West. He's got this quest for new places. Now, part of it fires his writing. He's excited about meeting new people and new settings, and you'll see in the book, it usually is accompanied by a new woman.
Okay, so speaking of the women, there's this letter that is featured to Marlene Dietrich, who he was close with, which I hadn't realized. In it, he says he had truly only loved 5 women. You have 5 main chapters, which are Agnes, and then the 4 wives. There's, let's see if I can name them, Hadley, Pauline, who he started with before, right?
Yes.
Divorcing Hadley, and then there's Martha, the intrepid reporter, and then Mary, who he was married to until his death.
Right.
But there are more women than that show up in the book.
Yes.
Because they're mistresses. There's a very young woman he pines for, kind of almost embarrassingly in his older years.
Yes. No fool like an old fool.
So have you come to some conclusions about who you think those 5 women
Well, those
were?
5 women, when you read the last chapter, are mentioned in that letter, and they don't necessarily include his wives. And so
I think some good teasers here, I think, right?
He says he was in love with 5 women, and he says this to Marlene Dietrich, who was, you're all too young to really remember her, but I mean, she was sort of the female version of Ernest Hemingway. I mean, she had many men in her life, and she was very adventuresome too. And they actually met on a cruise ship, and she was very beautiful. There's a tremendous picture in the book of her with this great fur coat and this alligator purse, and they're walking out of some hotel in Paris together, and he knew who she was. And so she's on a cruise ship, and she goes to sit down at a table at dinner, and she says, oh my goodness, if I sit down here, I will be the 13th person, and that's bad luck. So Ernest goes, not to worry, I'll sit there too, and there'll be 14 of us. That was the beginning of their relationship, and it lasted 40 years. Phone calls, letters. They would travel together across the ocean on the same ship. They would meet together at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. And throughout his life, he writes to her. Now, at the end of his life, he's still married to Mary, wife number 4, but he's writing to her, and the letter is in the book, and he tells her how much he loves her. And he does. So I think that is one of the women. But I think by the time you read about the different women and you kind of read where he was at different points in his life, you will see who he loved. So Kate mentions, yes, there was this younger woman. So during his marriage to wife number 4, he had this huge infatuation with Adriana Ivancic. So by the end of his life, he was famous and he was fairly wealthy, and he, at age close to 50, he becomes infatuated with an 18-year-old girl, Adriana Ivancic. And he says, you know, she's his muse and she inspires his writing, and he invites her to the house in Cuba. And her mother comes along as a chaperone. But unlike the other women that he kind of was infatuated with, Adriana has no real romantic interest in him. She's interested because he's famous, and she's sort of flattered by his attention. But she shows up in a book. She becomes Renata in Across the River into the Trees. And again, there is a romantic interlude in this book that is set in Venice, where they're making love in a gondola. and Adriana's parents were just outraged because it becomes pretty obvious who he's writing about. And she is from this Catholic, aristocratic Venetian family. And the family is like, oh my God, you know, what is he doing? He's writing about our daughter. Now, about 5 years ago, there was a Hemingway conference in Venice. And Adriana's brother, who was very old at the time, comes to the conference. He talks to all these Hemingway scholars, and he goes, now I want to set it straight about Adriana. Our Adriana, she was a good girl. There was nothing going on with her and Ernest. So, I mean, like Agnes von Kurowski, these women that show up in his books spend the rest of their life sort of having to deny, you know, what's said in the book, because people tend to believe the book rather than the real story, because he's such a good storyteller.
Did he lose many friends that way, or his charm was so big?
He had lots of friends, but he also had enemies too. Yeah.
I want to go back. You mentioned that Marlene Dietrich was so much like him. And one thing that really jumped out to me was this tension where he seemed to want someone like him. Martha jumps to mind because she was this reporter who would go into just war zones, and he ran away with her, married her, but then later is sending her telegrams to say, you're supposed to be in my home. You're supposed to be in my bed. You're not supposed to be out being a journalist. So there's this tension about kind of wanting the adventurer, but kind of just wanting a wife. And how did you come to understand that tension? And
well, you know, one of the great things about writing about Hemingway now is that there's this phenomenal Hemingway Letters Project. And Sandra Spanier at Penn State University has developed this project where she's collecting all of Ernest Hemingway's letters. They now have 6 volumes. They expect it to be 17 volumes. So Sandra has a lifetime project putting all these letters together. But you can get a lot of information from his letters. And so one of Hemingway's friends was F. Scott Fitzgerald. And one of the things that it kind of answers Kate's question is, you know, he had this conflict because he wanted to be a faithful husband. He was brought up in this household where, you know, you had in an environment where you had one wife for the rest of your life, and that's the way things were. But he had this tendency where he wanted to move on. So he writes to F. Scott Fitzgerald and talks about his version of heaven. And his version of heaven is a place where you have 2 houses. One where you live with your wife, and it's a monogamous relationship, and you're happy and you're devoted. And then the other house has 7 floors, each with a new prostitute on each floor. So that kind of explains his thinking. That's his idea of heaven. There also is, and it comes out in To Have and to Have Not, which is the book that he wrote during his Key West years, during the Depression. It wasn't such a great book, but it was a really good movie, and it was the one that catapulted Lauren Bacall to fame because she was, gorgeous and 19 in that movie. And in the beginning of that book, he talks about some of the people that he meets in Key West. And he says, men aren't really meant to be monogamous. If they have a blonde, they want a redhead. If they have a redhead, they want somebody with dark hair. No matter what they have, if they have this, they want something different. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of his mentality. He tries very hard in each of his marriages to be faithful, and he just can't help himself.
We were talking a little bit about, and we admitted that it's, the more you research, the harder it is to love him sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. But also part of what you showed to me is just possibly how much those early experiences really affected him in a way that would lead to that behavior, right? I mean, he was how old when he was injured badly and just saw the real intensity of war, right? Yeah. And also, I hadn't realized, I don't know how much everyone realizes what a lauded war hero he was for that. He got a lot of attention, a lot of attention there and here when he came back, right? Yeah. And then had his heart broken. So, do you say any more about?
Well, war was very important to him. So one of the things that happened here in this house is that both of his grandfathers lived in Oak Park, and both of them were veterans of the Civil War. And there's a picture of his paternal grandfather, Anson Hemingway, wearing his Civil War uniform with his medals and his hat, and he's marching in the 1915 Memorial Day parade in Oak Park. So in 1915, Ernest would have been about 16 years old. And it's these grandfathers that say, this is how men show honor and courage. You go into war and you battle with courage and honor, and you fight the enemy, and this is what masculinity is all about. So when Ernest graduates from high school, World War I is going on in Europe, and he is excited to get over there, and he's thinking, I'm going to do what my grandfathers told me to do. I'm going to, be a hero. And he gets over there, and of course World War I is not his grandfather's war. World War I is trench warfare, there's gas, it's ugly. And he is taking supplies down to Italian soldiers, and he's in a trench with 3 Italian soldiers, and they're hit with an Austrian shell. One of the soldiers is killed immediately, another gets his legs blown off, and the third one, Ernest is injured, and Ernest puts him on his back and tries to take him to safety. And in doing that, he's hit in the back of his legs with Austrian machine gun fire. So he's thinking, this is absolutely a transformational experience in Ernest Hemingway's life, because it's not the kind of warfare that his grandfathers had talked about. And so now he's a passive victim. So he spends the rest of his life, and really you see this in all of his books, in trying to show what is courage. How do men really show courage in a modern world? And the critics have named this the Hemingway Code. And you'll see that a courageous hero in Hemingway's eyes is someone that lives with grace under pressure. Hemingway believes all of us are injured in some way. We all face difficult situations. So how do you face a difficult situation? You don't engage in self-pity. You don't turn to religion. You do the best you can. So you may know that Hemingway was really fascinated with bullfighting. A bullfighter, Pedro Romero in Sun Also Rises, is the hero because he's able to face danger, death, with courage. And a really good bullfighter teases that bull with the muleta to come closer and closer and closer. And then at the right moment, puts the sword down the bull's spine, severs the spinal cord, and puts the sword into its heart, and the bull just drops. And Hemingway was fascinated with good bullfighting because of the ability of a bullfighter to emulate grace under pressure. That's like in his first book. By the end of his career, when he's writing things like For Whom the Bell Tolls, another example would be the code hero in that book, Robert Jordan, who's fighting on the losing side of the Spanish Civil War. He knows he's going to die, but he says, I have fought for what I believe in. It's a great world. I hate very much to leave it. And then he dies. And you feel sympathy for the way this man faces his end with grace under pressure. So the story, my book, is his passions: writing, women, war. I believe that writing was his first passion, but war was fascinating to Hemingway because it was a way for him to show how men face dangerous situations. It was a perfect setting to observe people. And because of his newspaper experience, he was really a good observer of people.
And he seemed not shy to put himself quite close to danger as a journalist later. Right. You know, very, very in the thick of things. I was so interested. Martha tries to drag him to go back and report at one point, and he doesn't want to because he is patrolling in his fishing boat. He's patrolling near Cuba for submarines.
Yes.
So that was interesting because that idea of something new. He could have gone back to the familiar danger, but was looking for kind of a new way to engage.
Yeah.
That was crazy. That I had never heard of that at all. I didn't want to forget to mention another really cool thing about the book. I thought was the foreword is written by Mariel Hemingway, who we know as an actress was his granddaughter, and how she describes the book, I think, really goes with this conversation we've been having. She says, "This book is not merely a biography, but an exploration of a soul, my grandfather's soul, torn between the twin poles of love and death. Always writing, always living with unparalleled intensity." So, kind of looking for those areas of intensity wherever he found them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which makes for a good read, everybody.
Yeah.
A good read. There was a couple other things I wanted to, curious to ask
Let me just
about.
say that if you get the book, read the foreword. You know, usually forewords are kind of boring. It's like, you know, the publisher will say, "Okay, Nancy, your book is done. Who's going to write the foreword?" And you're like, "I don't know." Well, so Mariel Hemingway I gives talks about overcoming depression and personal issues in your life. And I was teaching a class in California, and I had a student who said, "You know, Mariel Hemingway's coming to my country club. Would you like to come and meet her?" And I'm thinking, yes, of course. And so I go and I meet her. And I bring her a copy of my first book, Influencing Hemingway, and she's so nice and she's so sweet. And she goes, "Oh, of course, she pretends like she knew about it and read it, you know." And then I said, "Gee, you know, you look like your grandmother." And she's probably 60 years old now, but she is absolutely beautiful. And she is Hadley and Bumby's daughter. So she is the granddaughter of the son of Ernest's first marriage. And she does have this square jaw that Hadley Richardson had. And so we had our pictures taken together at this country club. And then after I finished the book, I thought, gosh, you know, it'd be so neat if she would write the foreword. So I write her this begging email, please, will you write the foreword? And I put the picture of us together. I said, I heard you speak. And she did. And as Kate said, it's sort of interesting to get her take, because she's reading my take on her family, her father and her grandfather and her grandmother, and of course Ernest's first wife is Hadley Richardson, for whom Muriel is named. So there's this neat little connection. It was fun.
And the fact that she speaks on mental health, and so much of what you read about, or under the surface especially, about his life, it relates to his father's struggles, his own. And so I think that through line coming down to her, I think, is really touching. Yeah,
she begins her talk saying, with 8 members of my family committed suicide.
So one thing I noticed in reading the book, you have photos throughout the book, so many very interesting photos, and from the JFK library, or the this or the that, and then there's some photos that are from your collection, which obviously you've gone far and wide to study Hemingway. What's the farthest and widest you've gone to get more insight into the man, or to see where he'd been? Or
well, I've just been to a lot of places. Probably one of the most interesting was I was writer in residence in Sun Valley the winter of 2021 in his home in Ketchum, Idaho. And I lived there alone, and this was the house where he committed suicide. So I had a blog called Sleeping with Hemingway's Ghost, because it was sort of, it was kind of funny to be there, but alone. And also you mentioned the photos. Where's Kathleen? Stand up. This lady is the archivist of the Oak Park Public Library, and responsible for helping me get some of the early photos in this book. And she also is the caretaker of the Dear John letter, the Agnes von Kurowski letter, where she goes, you know what, Ernest, dear boy, I'm marrying somebody else. So, yeah. Thank you for your help, Kathleen.
I have just a couple more questions. What was most interesting, exciting to uncover in this process, this round of research? Anything come to mind that was just most surprising or interesting?
Well, yeah. I have this shirt that says, I'm Hemingway's 5th wife. But I threw it out. After I read what he did to the others, I thought, no, I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, it sort of changed my opinion of him. Yeah. I mean, he really, he was charming, and the women certainly were attracted to him, but they were kind of used. Yeah.
And in the end, as his health was deteriorating, he didn't seem himself.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I went to Sun Valley was there still are people out there that knew him. And so I had the opportunity to interview a number of them. And he had tried to commit suicide a number of times, and they all saw this very sad decline of Hemingway, and how he just wasn't the same person that he had been before. And so actually, when he did end his life, his 4th wife denied that it was a suicide. She said, oh, it was an accident with a gun. But anyone who knew Ernest and his interest in hunting and his ability to use weapons knew that he wouldn't have an accident with a gun. And then when Hotchner wrote Papa Hemingway, he said that it was a suicide. And Mary tried to sue him, but she lost the suit. And then she goes, yeah, no. It was a suicide.
So given all of these things we've just said, I want to go back to my opening comment about how what we read in schools isn't quite the same anymore. Hemingway was just required reading for years and years, and isn't anymore. And you'll hear people talking about toxic masculinity and all that, right? And yet I was sad when my daughter didn't get assigned any, especially being at OPRF, that she didn't get assigned any books. And so I'm curious if, given your throwing out of the T-shirt and all that, if you would still make a case that he should be part of the canon and part of the common curriculum, and if you can tell us why.
Well, I'm obviously very biased because I think Hemingway is a great writer. But, we still read Shakespeare. And we read Shakespeare because of his universal ideas. So Romeo and Juliet talks about two feuding families. And Shakespeare makes the case of what a tragedy this is because of the feud, their children die. Or you read King Lear, and it's the idea of feuds within families and how sad that is. And so those are ideas that, even though Shakespeare wrote about that hundreds of years ago, those kinds of things are still going on today. And so people can go to a Shakespearean play or read a play and go, yeah, I get it. This is still happening today. And I think that Hemingway falls into the same category in that he talks about how men, and all of his books fall into this kind of formula almost. How do men face challenging situations? And he gives us examples of how people face challenging situations. They don't engage in self-pity. He doesn't show that religion is a great help. He shows them acting with courage and honor for whatever they believe in. And even if they lose, like Robert Jordan in For Whom the Bell Tolls, it's an honorable kind of death. Mm-hmm. And so I think that whole idea of, Hemingway calls it grace under pressure, is something that we can all kind of keep in mind in terms of our own personal behavior when we're facing tough situations. The other thing that Hemingway believes in terms of this heroic behavior is that everybody has a flaw. Everybody's injured. So by the time Robert Jordan is facing death, a horse has fallen on him and his legs are broken. There's no opportunity for him to get up and run away from the enemy. He has his injury. And I think that Hemingway would say that all of us in some way, kind of have our own personal injury, and we have to overcome it and do the best we can. And certainly that kind of falls into Muriel Hemingway's message too, about how you help yourself and overcome whatever flaw you might have.
Universal for sure.
Yeah.
Would you like to take a couple questions if
sure.
our guests have any? Any questions for the author before we
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll repeat it for the recording.
I'm thinking about grace under pressure and suicide, and I'm thinking about do the best you can and suicide. There seems to be a real disconnect between the ethics that you described in Hemingway's work and the example that he sets in his life. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and people have pondered, it seems like a contradiction that somebody who would say do the best you can would then commit suicide. But he, his father committed suicide, and he felt that was sort of a common sense way to end your life. That, if he could no longer, one of the things that I haven't talked about tonight, but he suffered from depression, and wife Mary took him to the Mayo Clinic where he had electric shock therapy, and that erased his memory. So the thing that he cared about the most, writing, he could no longer do. He was very much trying to complete one of his last books, and he just couldn't write anymore. And so that certainly was something that encouraged his own suicide. Yeah. Anything else?
Anyone else?
Is there any questions?
Oh, back there. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think he was a very strong man, and maybe he just felt that this was the end because he couldn't do it anymore. He didn't like weakness.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful thing in him.
Yeah. Thank you.
She was just making a comment on how he was such a strong man, and maybe he couldn't take his own weakness at the end.
Yep.
There was a question back there. There's this one. I think there's another one back there. Okay.
I have a fun one.
Okay.
So Agnes was a bit older.
Yes.
As was Hadley.
Yes.
Is there a connection there with his attraction to Hadley and looking towards?
These women were just attracted to him, and he just didn't say no. And Hadley really encouraged his writing. So they meet in Chicago. Hadley is from St. Louis. It's kind of a fix-up for Ernest is living with some buddies in Chicago, and Hadley comes in and they meet each other and they date, and then she falls in love with him, and she's encouraging him to go, well, originally it was going to be Italy, and then Sherwood Anderson says, no, you really should go to Paris. That's where all the young writers are. And Hadley says, well, I've got this little trust fund. Let's just go. And, she's just, she's thinking Ernest is great. She has total faith in him as a writer. And they live very frugally in Paris. But it's Hadley who encourages him to go. So, yeah, I don't know. After that, the women get a little bit younger.
And then very young.
Down, yeah, it kind of averages out with 18. Okay. Well, thank you all.
We had one last question.
More.
One last question.
When you went to the Mayo Clinic and had the problem with the electric shock therapy, wasn't there some role that J. Edgar Hoover didn't like him or was suspicious of him somehow? I remember in that phase.
Yes.
There was something.
Okay, so this brings up something that we didn't talk about tonight, Ernest Hemingway and J. Edgar Hoover, and this is actually going to be about my next book, which is Hemingway's FBI file. He has a 122-page FBI file. And so, as Kate mentioned, there was this period of time in Hemingway's life. Martha was in Europe during World War II, and Ernest was in Cuba chasing German submarines with his fishing boat. And Ernest had the full support of Spiro Braden, who was the American ambassador to Cuba. Braden was giving him fuel for the boat, giving him bazookas, all sorts of ammunition, grenades, because Ernest's plan was when a German submarine surfaced along his fishing boat, he was going to wait for the submarine to surface. The guys were going to come up on deck. The hatch would be open. They'd throw grenades down the conning tower. And he would be, once again, the war hero. Now, so Braden was supportive of this. And Ernest was writing all these reports to Braden. And J. Edgar Hoover didn't like that he was getting all this support from the American ambassador. And so this was the initiation of his FBI file. And it goes on from there. But yeah.
Well, it's suspicion from his time in the Spanish Civil War.
Yes.
And in Cuba of communist allegiance. And
yes. Yeah, because when Ernest was fighting on the Loyalist side and writing about the Loyalist side in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, he was supporting the Spanish communists. And of course, Hoover didn't like that.
So, teaser for the next one, right? Help me thank Nancy so much.